Part 1. The House of Morgan. The story does not begin in a boardroom, nor on Wall Street, nor in the glittering towers of global finance that now span from New York to London to Hong Kong. It begins in silence, in power that moves without sound, without election, without borders. Power rooted not in governments, but in trust. Trust in money, trust in credit, trust in those who hold the keys to both. This is the story of Morgan Stanley. But to understand Morgan Stanley, we must go much further back, before Morgan Stanley was Morgan Stanley, before Wall Street was Wall Street, before the United States was a superpower. We must go back to a dynasty, to the House of Morgan, a family, a network, and an empire that became the financial nervous system of the modern world. The story of Morgan Stanley is a story of power that does not need to announce itself, influence that operates behind the curtain, decisions made quietly, but felt globally, by presidents, by industries, by everyday citizens who may never know the name of the hand that shaped the outcome. The foundation of an invisible empire. The foundation was laid in the 19th century, during a time when the global economy was still forming, and the world's great powers were defined by their railroads, their banks, and their corporations. The name Morgan was not yet synonymous with wealth, not yet whispered in the halls of Congress, not yet feared in European courts. It began with a man named Junius Spencer Morgan, a merchant banker working in London. Junius understood something that few others did. The real power in the world does not belong to kings or presidents, but to those who fund them. He built relationships across oceans and across political systems, with governments desperate for loans and industries desperate for expansion. These were the early seeds of a financial network that would soon span continents. But it was his son, John Pierpont Morgan, known to history as J.P. Morgan, who would transform that network into an empire. J.P. Morgan did not seek headlines, but headlines found him. They had no choice, because wherever money moved in America, Morgan was involved. Railroads, electricity, steel, shipping, telecommunications. If an industry defined the United States in the late 1800s, Morgan either controlled it or helped create it. He was not a politician, not a general, not a monarch. And yet, when the U.S. Treasury ran out of gold during the Panic of 1893, it was J.P. Morgan, not the president, who saved the country from collapse. Morgan arranged a private loan to the federal government. A private citizen stabilized the U.S. economy. And so the legend began, the birth of a financial giant. By the early 1900s, one entity sat at the center of American finance, J.P. Morgan and Company. This was the predecessor of everything that would later become Morgan Stanley. Morgan's influence was so vast that the U.S. government came to fear him. In 1912, Morgan was summoned to testify before Congress. The nation wanted to understand how one man could effectively control the American economy. He replied with a sentence that has echoed through history. The first thing is character, because money cannot buy it. J.P. Morgan. But what he meant was something deeper. Real influence is not just held through wealth. It is held through trust. Trust from governments, corporations, and other banks. This trust made Morgan indispensable, and that indispensability made him powerful. But power like this invites enemies. And the more Morgan's empire grew, the more the U.S. government feared a private financial monarchy. President Theodore Roosevelt targeted the Morgans during his antitrust crusades. The Pujo Committee investigated the Money Trust, a network of banks and firms linked to Morgan that allegedly controlled the majority of the nation's credit. By the time the dust settled, one conclusion was clear. The House of Morgan was not merely a bank. It was a shadow infrastructure of the American economy. And so, the government sought to limit it. The Great Divide, 1933. The crash of 1929 destroyed markets, fortunes, and faith in the financial elite. Congress reacted with sweeping reforms designed to prevent banks from gambling with public deposits. One of these reforms was the Glass-Steagall Act of 1933. Glass-Steagall forced banks to split into two types. 1. Commercial banks, which held deposits and made loans. 2. Investment banks, which advised corporations, sold securities, and raised capital. The House of Morgan had to choose. J.P. Morgan and Company remained a commercial bank, but the investment banking side, the division responsible for underwriting major corporate financing, was forced to separate. And so, in 1935, Morgan Stanley was born. Led by Harold Stanley and Henry Morgan, the grandson of J.P. Morgan, the new firm inherited the networks, the clients, the industry prestige, the legacy of the House of Morgan. But it was also independent, a new entity with an old soul. Morgan Stanley stepped into the world already among the most powerful investment banks in the United States. Unlike other firms, it did not need to prove itself. Its reputation preceded it. From the beginning, Morgan Stanley specialized in advising the country's largest corporations and raising capital on Wall Street. The firm became known for intelligence, discretion, and strategic influence. It did not seek publicity. It shaped policy quietly, through relationships, through information. This understated influence would become the defining characteristic of Morgan Stanley for decades. The quiet masters of corporate America. In the mid-20th century, Morgan Stanley played a central role in financing America's rise as an industrial superpower. The firm raised billions for companies like AT&T, General Motors, U.S. Steel, Standard Oil. These were not just corporations, they were the engines of the modern American world. Morgan Stanley advised their mergers, their expansions, their international strategies. It was not just a bank, it was a counselor to power. In the post-war boom, Morgan Stanley became a key architect of American capitalism's golden age. Yet it did so with a public image of restraint, intellectual rigor, and quiet professionalism. While other banks cultivated glamour or flamboyance, Morgan Stanley cultivated discipline. Its culture was built on a single guiding principle: the firm, the relationship, and the client, before the individual. Careers were built not on showmanship, but on loyalty and internal hierarchy. It was, in many ways, a modern financial aristocracy. But power never stays quiet forever. By the 1970s, global finance had begun to shift. The world was changing. The US dollar was no longer backed by gold. Oil shocks disrupted global economies. New financial instruments were emerging. Stock markets were becoming global. Corporate mergers were accelerating. Debt was becoming a strategic tool. The financial world was becoming more complex, more volatile, more aggressive. Morgan Stanley, disciplined, traditional, conservative, faced a choice: adapt or fade. The firm, once the most powerful name in corporate finance, now found itself challenged by more aggressive rivals. Goldman Sachs, Lehman Brothers, Drexel Burnham Lambert. These firms embraced risk. They embraced new markets. They embraced speed and innovation. Morgan Stanley began to feel pressure to keep up, to remain relevant, to compete. The firm that had once shaped the rules of the financial world now had to survive inside it. The shift begins. In the late 1970s and early 1980s, Morgan Stanley began a quiet but profound transformation. It expanded beyond corporate underwriting into sales, trading, and global markets, areas that required not patience and discretion, but aggression and speed. The personality of the firm began to change. The culture shifted. Where once the firm was guided by quiet strategy, it now entered the growing culture of financial competition, risk, and ambition. The Wall Street that was emerging was not the Wall Street of the 1950s. It was faster, smarter, sharper, more dangerous. and Morgan Stanley was stepping into it, not recklessly, not loudly, but decisively. The first steps toward becoming the modern Morgan Stanley, the powerhouse we know today, were now underway. But with growth comes vulnerability, and with vulnerability comes the possibility of downfall. The story that follows, in Part 2, reveals how Morgan Stanley would rise to global dominance, and how that dominance would carry consequences felt across economies, nations, and ordinary lives. Part 2. The Rise of a Global Power. Morgan Stanley's transformation did not happen overnight. It was subtle at first, almost invisible, like the slow turning of a tide. But once the tide had turned, it reshaped everything. By the late 1970s and early 1980s, the world of finance was no longer a quiet realm of long-term investments and corporate stewardship. It was becoming a battlefield, one defined by speed, risk, data, and new financial engineering. Morgan Stanley, once the reserved counselor to industrial giants, found itself standing at the edge of a new era, an era that rewarded aggression over patience, innovation over tradition, market dominance over measured discretion. And so, Morgan Stanley stepped forward, not recklessly, not loudly, but deliberately, with intent. This is where the story shifts. From influence to power. From guidance to control. From legacy to ambition. The dawn of modern Wall Street. To understand Morgan Stanley's rise during the 1980s, one must understand the environment that allowed it, and many other firms, to ascend. The global economy was changing. Governments around the world were deregulating financial markets, removing restrictions, lowering barriers, and unleashing a kind of economic energy that had been restrained for decades. In the United States, under President Ronald Reagan, deregulation became a central principle. In the United Kingdom, Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher pursued similar policies. Banks were suddenly free to expand, to innovate, to profit. And innovation did not mean new technologies. It meant new ways to make money from money. The rise of derivatives, futures contracts, options, complex financial instruments that few truly understood, but which promised extraordinary returns. This was the new Wall Street, and Morgan Stanley saw it clearly. The shift to global markets. Morgan Stanley began to expand beyond the United States, aggressively building international offices and forging relationships with foreign governments, corporations, and financial institutions. London, Tokyo, Hong Kong, Frankfurt. By the mid-1980s, Morgan Stanley was no longer just an American firm. It was becoming a global financial power, able to move capital across borders faster than governments could regulate it. This global reach gave Morgan Stanley something few institutions possessed: leverage. Leverage over markets, leverage over industries, leverage over national economies. The firm no longer merely advised corporations, it shaped them. The mergers and acquisitions era. The 1980s were the age of the corporate takeover. Companies were bought, sold, broken apart, and reassembled like pieces on a chessboard. Fortunes were made overnight. Industries were transformed in ways that could not be undone. Morgan Stanley became one of the central architects of this era. The firm advised on some of the most high-profile mergers and acquisitions in history. Oil giants merging to control supply chains. Telecommunications firms consolidating national networks. Manufacturing conglomerates swallowing smaller rivals. Energy companies expanding into foreign markets. It was a time when the value of a company was no longer based purely on what it produced, but on the financial strategies behind it. A business could be profitable and still be dismantled if its pieces were worth more than the whole. Workers, communities, and entire industries became secondary concerns. The market was the new sovereign, and Morgan Stanley was one of its chief ministers. A culture reborn. The shift inside Morgan Stanley was profound. For decades, the firm had cultivated a culture of restraint, discipline, and quiet professionalism. But the new Wall Street rewarded something different: speed, competition, individual performance, market dominance. Morgan Stanley began hiring a new breed of talent: aggressive dealmakers, quantitative analysts, financial strategists, and traders who were comfortable taking risks. The tone inside the firm changed. Deal rooms became more intense, markets moved faster, the stakes grew higher. Those who succeeded became legends, those who failed disappeared. This was not the era of the old House of Morgan, guided by stability and long-term perspectives. This was a new Morgan Stanley, driven by the pursuit of market advantage, and the world felt the effects. The power to move markets. By the 1990s, Morgan Stanley had become one of the most influential financial firms in the world. It no longer simply reacted to markets, it moved them. When Morgan Stanley issued a recommendation, stocks shifted. When it backed an emerging industry, capital followed. When it forecasted economic direction, policymakers listened. Corporations relied on the firm for strategy. Governments consulted it during crises. Investors watched its every move. Morgan Stanley had become something more than a bank. It was an interpreter of the global economy, able to shape the narrative that defined market behavior. This meant influence, and influence meant power. Not loud, visible political power, but quiet power, the kind that shapes outcomes without announcing itself, the kind of power that moves through boardrooms, not speeches, through investment flows, not elections, the kind of power that affects everyone, whether they know it or not. The tech boom, a new frontier. By the late 1990s, a new revolution was underway: the rise of the internet. Silicon Valley was exploding with innovation. New companies were emerging faster than the financial world could evaluate them, and Morgan Stanley positioned itself at the center of this new technological age. The firm became one of the leading managers of initial public offerings, IPOs, for technology companies. It played central roles in bringing public companies such as Cisco Systems, eBay, AOL, Yahoo. These companies would become pillars of the digital age. Morgan Stanley was not just financing them, it was defining the structure of Silicon Valley's relationship with the global economy. Technology companies became some of the most valuable corporations in the world. Morgan Stanley helped shape the valuation models that determined how these companies would be priced. This was not simply banking. This was the writing of the economic future. The dot-com bubble. But where there is growth, there is speculation. And where there is speculation, there is risk. The late 1990s became a frenzy. Companies with no profits, sometimes with no real products, were valued in the billions. Investors poured money into anything with the word "internet" attached to it. Morgan Stanley was among the banks that fueled the boom. By underwriting IPOs and promoting them to investors, it played a key role in inflating valuations. And then, the bubble burst. In the year 2000, the NASDAQ crashed. Thousands of companies collapsed. Millions of investors lost fortunes. The economy faltered. Retirements were wiped out. Families suffered. The public looked for someone to blame. And once again, financial institutions found themselves at the center of the storm. Morgan Stanley was accused of promoting companies it knew were overvalued, of profiting from market enthusiasm while retail investors bore the losses. The firm denied wrongdoing. Regulators investigated, settlements were reached, but the damage was done. The world had seen how deeply a financial institution could shape and distort economic reality. And this was only the beginning. The stage is set for crisis. By the early 2000s, Morgan Stanley had become a global power, a financial innovator, a market mover, a dominant investment bank. But its greatest challenge, and its most dramatic transformation, was still ahead. The next chapter of Morgan Stanley's history would involve mortgages turned into financial instruments, risk disguised as stability, global markets built on fragile assumptions, the rise of an unprecedented housing boom, and the most devastating financial collapse since the Great Depression. This was the era that would reveal the true consequences of financial power, the era that would test Morgan Stanley's resilience, its identity, its future, the era that would shake the global economy and millions of lives with it. And it would happen not by accident, but by design. Part 3: Crisis, Reckoning, and the New Age of Power. The world entered the 21st century with optimism. Globalization was accelerating. Markets were booming. Technology was transforming daily life. But beneath that optimism, a new financial infrastructure was being built, one that appeared sophisticated, stable, and mathematically sound, yet rested on foundations far weaker than almost anyone realized. This system would ultimately trigger the greatest financial crisis since the Great Depression, and Morgan Stanley was not merely present when it happened. It was deeply involved in the architecture that made it possible. The financial alchemy of the early 2000s. The crisis began with something familiar and seemingly safe: homes. For most families, a home is not simply a building. It is stability, identity, security, the place where life unfolds. And because housing felt safe, mortgages felt safe. Banks historically kept the mortgages they issued. If a borrower couldn't pay, the bank was responsible for the loss. This created caution, discipline, and oversight. But in the late 1990s and early 2000s, everything changed. Financial institutions began securitizing mortgages, gathering thousands of home loans, bundling them together, and selling the rights to future payments as financial products. These were called mortgage-backed securities, collateralized debt obligations, structured investment vehicles. They were complex, they were opaque, and they were immensely profitable. Morgan Stanley, alongside other major Wall Street firms, became one of the largest producers and distributors of these instruments. The firm was not merely selling mortgages, it was selling belief. Belief that diversified mortgage pools were safe, belief that housing prices would always rise, belief that mathematical models could prevent risk. For a time, that belief appeared justified. Profits surged, markets soared, homeownership expanded, but something fundamental was changing. Mortgages were no longer granted to those who could reasonably repay them. They were granted to anyone who could sign their name. The financial system no longer cared whether a borrower could afford a home, because once the mortgage was sold, the risk no longer belonged to the lender. The machine kept expanding, faster, larger, more reckless. The world was building a financial skyscraper on the loosest possible foundation, and the higher it rose, the more catastrophic the fall would become. The illusion of stability. Through the mid-2000s, Morgan Stanley rode the growing wave of mortgage securitization. The firm invested heavily in structured financial products. It built internal teams to model risk and design new securities. It earned billions. To the outside world, the firm appeared strong, stable, and in control. But inside Morgan Stanley, many analysts began to notice something alarming. The models only worked if housing prices continued to rise. And nothing in economic history rises forever. Warnings circulated, reports were written, some spoke up. But the system itself, not just at Morgan Stanley but across global finance, had momentum. Banks, investors, pension funds, insurance companies, and governments all depended on the continuation of the mortgage boom. No one wanted to stop the machine. So the machine kept running until it couldn't. The fall, 2007 to 2008. The collapse began quietly. Housing prices stopped rising, then they began to fall. Mortgage defaults increased, but the market continued to ignore the warning signs until it couldn't. The financial instruments built on mortgages began to fail. The values of mortgage securities crumbled. Counterparties stopped trusting each other. What followed was not simply a financial decline, it was the rapid unwinding of a global system built on borrowed confidence. In September 2008, Lehman Brothers collapsed. Lehman was not just another investment bank, it was one of the pillars of global finance. Its failure sent a shockwave through the world, and Morgan Stanley was next. Inside the firm, panic spread. Morgan Stanley's stock price plunged. Its liquidity evaporated. Its survival was uncertain. The firm faced the same fate as Lehman: total collapse. For a brief moment in September 2008, Morgan Stanley stood at the edge of the abyss. The world did not yet know it. But the global financial system was hours, perhaps minutes from breaking. Then something extraordinary happened. Morgan Stanley was rescued, not by the US government directly, but by Japan. The lifeline. As Morgan Stanley teetered, the firm received a critical capital infusion from the Mitsubishi UFJ Financial Group, one of Japan's largest banks. The deal stabilized the firm. It prevented a second major Wall Street collapse. It helped stop the global financial system from cascading into complete failure. The move was strategic, calculated, and deeply symbolic. One of the most iconic institutions in American financial history survived because of international intervention. The House of Morgan, the institution that once financed the US government in the 1890s, now found itself saved by a foreign power. History, as always, turns on irony. Reinvention after crisis. Morgan Stanley survived the financial collapse, but survival came with consequences. Regulators tightened their grip. Trust was damaged. Public opinion turned hostile. The firm faced lawsuits, investigations, and criticism. But Morgan Stanley did something many institutions could not. It adapted. Morgan Stanley shifted away from the volatile world of high-risk trading and mortgage speculation. It moved strategically into wealth management, a more stable, relationship-driven business. This shift was not merely tactical, it was philosophical. The firm began acquiring businesses that focused on long-term client stewardship. In 2009, Morgan Stanley formed a joint venture with Citigroup's Smith Barney unit. In 2013, it acquired full ownership of that wealth management operation. By the 2020s, it acquired E-Trade and Eaton Vance. It became one of the largest wealth management firms in the world. This was a return, in a sense, to its origins: quiet influence, professional counsel, strategic planning. Morgan Stanley was once again positioning itself as the advisor to power, not merely a participant in financial markets. But the modern power it now exercised was different, more subtle, more distributed, more deeply embedded in the daily lives of individuals, retirees, corporations, and national pension systems. Morgan Stanley no longer controlled industrial railroads or oil empires. It now held something far more personal: the financial futures of millions. Power, influence, and hidden agendas. Today, Morgan Stanley is one of the most influential financial institutions in the world. Its analysts shape markets. Its advisors shape corporate strategy. Its investment decisions shape the economic direction of entire nations. It influences interest rates, monetary policy debates, corporate governance, global trade flows, retirement planning for millions, investment strategies of governments and sovereign wealth funds. This influence is not always visible. It rarely appears in headlines. It does not seek applause or public recognition. Its power exists in the decisions made quietly in conference rooms: how capital should be allocated, which companies should grow, which industries should contract, which markets should be entered or abandoned, which risks should be taken or concealed. This is not conspiracy. This is structure. In a world driven by markets, those who move the markets shape the world. Morgan Stanley is not alone in this role. Other banks share the landscape: Goldman Sachs, JP Morgan, Citigroup, and more. But Morgan Stanley's power is unique. It has survived every era of economic transformation: industrialization, globalization, deregulation, crisis, digital expansion, and adapted each time. It does not hold power by force. It holds power through trust, just as J.P. Morgan understood in 1912. The legacy of quiet power. This story is not one of villains and heroes. It is a story of systems. Systems built by people, for better and worse. Systems that shape the world not through public decree, but through financial incentives. Systems that determine economic fate as surely as laws or elections. Morgan Stanley is a product of that world, a shaper of it, a reflection of it. It represents ambition, adaptation, innovation, influence, and consequence. It has financed growth that changed lives for the better. It has participated in speculation that caused suffering. It has rescued economies. And it has played roles in crises. It is not good, it is not evil, it is power. And power, real power, is seldom visible, but always felt. Closing reflection. When we look at the world today, at markets that rise and fall with extraordinary speed, at economies connected by invisible threads, at decisions made in boardrooms that shape the lives of millions, we are witnessing the legacy of institutions like Morgan Stanley. The history of Morgan Stanley is not merely the history of a bank. It is the story of how power works in the modern world, quietly, strategically, persistently, from the House of Morgan in the 19th century, to the crisis-ridden trading floors of 2008, to the vast global advisory networks of today. This is not just financial history. It is the story of influence, the story of trust, the story of an empire that never needed a flag to shape the world. The story of Morgan Stanley?